Hey, 8th grade. So today we're going to start talking about air masses that affect weather within the United States. So first we're going to start by talking about air masses and the heating of Earth's surface. So the heating of the Earth's surface in the atmosphere by the sun drives convection within the atmosphere and the oceans, producing winds and ocean currents. And ocean currents are driven by prevailing winds or those surface winds. The differences in air pressure cause the air to actually move. Winds move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. An air mass is a large body of air with similar temperature and moisture properties throughout, and air masses influence our weather. And the best source regions for air masses are large flat areas where air can be stagnant long enough to take on the characteristics of the surface below. So I'm going to explain what this actually means. So there's four major air masses that influence North America. And they're maritime polar, which is a cool and humid air mass that forms over the icy, cold North Atlantic. Maritime tropical, which is warm, humid air mass that forms over the Pacific Ocean. The continental polar, which is cold, dry air mass, which forms over Canada. And the continental tropical, which is a hot, dry air mass that forms over Mexico. So if you break these things apart, you see this maritime, and what that means is it's forming over an ocean because it's maritime. And continental means it's forming over a continent. You'll also notice these other two words, polar and tropical. As you have already probably guessed, the polar is talking about cooler areas and tropical is talking about warmer areas. All of these are types of air masses that influence America. So if we were to look at a map, you'll see we have these maritime polar coming in off of the Pacific, the continental polar from Canada, more maritime polar coming off of the Atlantic Ocean. And then if you look below, we have continental tropical coming off of Mexico, maritime tropical coming from the area off of the Mexican coast and the Pacific Ocean, and maritime tropical coming from both the Gulf and the Atlantic. So this map next to it tells you maritime polar is cold and wet, continental polar cold and dry, maritime polar cool and wet, continental tropical hot and dry, and maritime tropical warm and wet. So what happens when these air masses collide? When air masses collide at fronts, this causes storms to occur. So you have these colliding air masses, and they can form four different types of fronts. A cold front, a warm front, a stationary, and an occluded front. So if you look at this right here, we have both warm and cold fronts being shown, and you have warm fronts up here, and you have cool air fronts below, and this caused a rainstorm right here. If you have warm air sliding up over the cool air, you can also have a precipitation down here. Let's talk about cold fronts. When a faster cold air mass runs into a slower warm air mass, the denser cold air slides underneath the lighter warm air because we know that cold air is denser, and so that warm air tends to rise. Clouds form when the warm air rises and cools and then condenses. So as this warm air rises, it cools and condenses. And this condensation is what can then form these clouds. So the cold fronts are moving fast, and they bring really severe weather, such as heavy rain and snow or thunderstorms. When the front passes through, the temperatures drop. Hence the name cold front. Warm fronts. When fast-moving warm air mass overtakes a slower-moving cold air mass, it brings a really light rain. And the warm fronts arrive slowly, so the weather can be rainy or cloudy for several days because it moves at a much slower pace. After the front passes, the temperature warms up, and it tends to be more humid as evaporation occurs from the precipitation that already came down. An occluded front is when a warm air mass is caught between two cooler air masses. The temperature becomes cooler as the warm air is cut off, and the clouds can form and bring rain or snow. So if you look at this picture of an occluded front, you have this warm air getting stuck in between these two colder air areas. And you have this diagram here where an occluded front is shown with circles and triangles on the same side of the line. The circles indicate the cold and the triangles indicate the warm. And then in this area, you can end up with rain, snow, or thunderstorm. The last front we're going to talk about is called the stationary front, and this occurs when a cold air mass and a warm air mass meet, but they do not move each other. So the two air masses come together, and they're at this kind of standstill in the middle. And this can bring many days of clouds and precipitation. So you see this area where they meet, but neither one of them is able to push the other one either up or down. Because of that, you get the stationary front. And the symbol for a stationary front is this cold air and this warm air symbols on opposite sides of each other from the line. So you see in the stationary front, you have the warmer and the cooler colliding, which can then bring rain and clouds. Go ahead and move on to your worksheet for today. There's a key to help you identify the different fronts, and you're going to be looking at a map of the United States and identifying the type of weather and the fronts moving through at different locations.